Ladies and gentlemen, G20 Summit 2024 has concluded in Brazil's Rio de Janeiro, and it came at the crucial time of the world adjusting to the incoming US presidency of Donald Trump. Even as there were some key takeaways from the summit, the highlight turned out to be Biden, Trudeau and Meloni missing out on that G20 family photo. Logistics and timing issue is the reason that has been given for this rather bizarre blunder. But what many say is a bigger blunder is that neither the host nor any other member country waited for the three leaders to join in, something that Biden critics suggest wouldn't have happened if Donald Trump was the current American president. Meanwhile, on agenda this time was the war, battling global hunger and climate finance, while world leaders called for ceasefire in the wars and more aid for people in Gaza. There's not much that the developed world did to help. G20 agreed to scale up climate financing, but they failed to give any specific number on that. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi emphasized particularly on the food and fuel crisis that the global south is facing due to the wars. On the sidelines of the G20 summit, Indian and Chinese foreign ministers met amid the two countries moving towards resolving the border conflict. India and China will now be looking to resume the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, data sharing on trans-border rivers and direct flights between the two countries. Some rather significant decisions coming from the two countries. Let's get a wider perspective on this and talk about what G20 means at this moment in time with the geopolitical situation. On the broadcast, I'm joined by Mr. Suresh Kumar Goel. He's a former ambassador. I'm also joined by Mr. Pathikrit Pain, geopolitical analyst. Good evening and namaskar to both of you. Ambassador Goel, let me begin with you first. What were, for you, the key takeaways of the G20 summit? It's come at a crucial time when the world is now getting ready to adjust to a Donald Trump presidency. For you, the big takeaways?
Well, I've not read the declaration so far or any outcome document, but I do believe that there was a focus on global poverty and hunger, which was actually a continuation of what we did in Delhi. There was also something discussion about reform of the global or international financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, etc., and where they go in terms of the voting share, etc., there. But I think it was basically really focused on reform of the economic system in the world, and also the social issues and the issues of the global hunger and the poverty, which actually climate, of course, was one of the bull in the China shop, on which there was no agreement in terms of financing, etc. But they were the main issues. On the whole, Shreya, if you permit to say, with the exception of the optics, I really don't think that it went beyond what actually the world had begun to expect from the G20. And for me, one of the reasons is that the kind of rivalry, the contest that has existed over the last more than 2 or 3 decades, even since 2009, 15 years ago, when the world was plunged into an economic crisis, a financial crisis, not much had changed in the behavior of the countries concerned. And therefore, the G20 basically remained the same kind of contest between the developed and the developing countries, or now what is fashionably called the global south and the north, really. So I'm going to leave it there for the time being, for the further discussions, but I was rather disappointed that there was nothing really, there was no progress forward in terms of aspirations of the global south. Shreya.
Okay. Let me get in Pathikrit Pain into this conversation. Pathikrit, I want to talk about the wars and how, this G20 summit has been emphasizing on how the wars should end. There should be a humanitarian approach towards it and all of that. We've got Donald Trump coming in. He's been saying that, he's going to end the wars. particularly the Russia-Ukraine war. You have an outgoing American president in Joe Biden announcing that Ukraine is free to use US long-range missiles. The next day, you have Russian President Vladimir Putin signing an updated nuclear doctrine. Why and how do you think G20 and Donald Trump particularly can then end this war? That clearly isn't happening anytime soon.
Good evening, Shreya, and greetings to Ambassador Goel. Well, first and foremost, President Biden is trying to give the best farewell gift possible in terms of creating an unprecedented crisis from which Trump would find it very difficult to, stop the war. The use of these army tactical missile systems that United States have now allowed Ukraine to use into Russian territory may not have any kind of impact so far as the outcome of the war is concerned, but it would have a tremendous impact in terms of the change doctrine of nuclear weapons use that Russia has declared, which means all NATO members will be considered as an adversary. So in that kind of a scenario, I don't know even how much Trump would be able to sort it out, because I had predicted 2 weeks back perhaps that Biden will create all kinds of problems, not just the Biden but the entire lobby behind Biden, so that Trump cannot do much. So far as G20 is concerned, I don't think G20 has any kind of leverage as an organization to bring about any change. If you look at the declaration, G20 also talks about the same issues about reforms in the multilateral institutions, including UN, which UN would not. UN will not reform. UN does not have a dispute resolution mechanism. And the 5 major, or rather the global north countries which actually rule the roost so far as UN is concerned, they would simply not allow any kind of reform in the United Nations. So G20 has become more of a forum for annual meetings. The previous one, 2023, if you look at the success, it had a lot to do with the charisma of Prime Minister Modi himself and clout of India. So I think G20 members individually may still play some role, but I think it is very unlikely that anyone can do anything right now unless some common sense prevails so far as global north is concerned. If you look at the kind of scenario that is being building up, because Trump wanted NATO to be literally dismantled in terms of reducing, contribution to NATO or questioning many of the things, I think there are certain elements who are trying desperately to ensure something catastrophic happens, beyond which Trump will find it very difficult to salvage the situation. So if you look at the conflicts, if you ask me, G20 cannot do anything as an organization, because much like the United Nations, the veto or preventing G20 from doing anything will come from the same countries. And at the same time, individually also, what can smaller countries do? Look at the issue of G20 in terms of hunger, poverty. All these things are impacted by the war, definitely. And also look at climate change. Those who give lectures in global north on climate change, imagine the amount of pollution that is happened by war. Imagine the amount of pollution that is made every time a ballistic missile is launched. But they don't want to look at those things because the military industrial complex actually wants conflicts to continue, and they don't want the conflicts to end. Zelensky, for heaven's sake, if you ask me, my last point, I don't know what Zelensky wants. He has already literally destroyed his own country, and he is ensuring that the rest of the Europe gets into that same problem. So much like First and Second World War, I'm not saying we are looking at a world war. The next major conflict again is going to be Europe-centric, and Europe is solely responsible for that. Back to you, Shreya.
Pathikrit, you're right in saying that, Volodymyr Zelensky has been caught in this cobweb between America and Europe. And so far, Ukraine still doesn't have a NATO membership, a basis on which this entire war erupted. But Ambassador Goel, talking about what Pathikrit was saying, the fact that has G20 become as redundant as the United Nations then? Do we not expect anything from the developed world, from the G20 leaders coming together and finding a resolution?
Shreya, before I get into the question that you asked, the Ukraine issue reminded me that there is a new word in the lexicon these days, and that is a word called Ukraine. And you know what Ukraine means, being Ukraine, that you start with something, there are this whole host of people who come to your support, you say, get in the fight. Yeah, they're behind you. And eventually when it begins to lose, and it turns around to find support, there's nobody around. And that's what Ukraine means. And I think Zelensky has been truly Ukraine, really, in that sense. But anyway, going beyond Ukraine, the point really about G20 is that if you recall how G20 began, in 2009, at the time of the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, as a result of Lehman bankruptcy, which incidentally that happened because the American Federal Bank would not support Lehman at that time, plunging the whole world into a kind of a crisis from which it took more than a decade for them to emerge. But anyway, that is just incidental. The fact is, the G20 became a forum for dialogue between the emerging and the developed economies to stabilize the global financial systems. At the same time, the BRICS began 2009, if you remember now, and BRICS began as a matter of forum between the emerging market economies, major economies all across the world, to coordinate the positions to become a geo-economic platform. Now, that was the global south, beginning of the global south. And what I'm trying to drive at is that G20 is useful. It's a smaller, more manageable, plurilateral organization where there is a possibility of a conversation between global south and the developed economies. UN is not a forum. There are too many issues
But
mixed up over
unfortunately,
there.
Ambassador Goel, it's only
Fun.
conversation that's happening. It seems like there's only words,
Yes,
there's only lip service that's happening and no clear, strong implementation.
Shreya, I was coming to that. And therefore, eventually, if you want to reform the economic system in the world, neither the global south nor the developed countries can do it alone. So to my mind, G20 is the only viable forum where both sides are represented in a kind of a conversation, discussion, which can lead to a result, and the political issues are not part of it. If you remember the Security Council reforms, you do talk about those things, but the Security Council reforms, UN reforms, they don't hold up the discussions. So my hope is the G20 can slowly get around to discussing the nitty-gritty of what the world survives on. And that is important. Climate, funds transfer, limited, but yes.
Okay.
And I think the Americans, even after Trump becomes the president, would be more cautious about going against G20 than the UN, where it doesn't matter what you do. Shreya.
Okay, Pathikrit, you mentioned climate. There is COP29, of course, and we didn't see anything substantial that came out of this G20 summit. There were certain expectations, but beyond, saying the fact that they will scale up the climate finance, there is no substantial outcome of the G20 summit as far as the climate crisis and climate action is concerned. Of course, there's been, that tussle going on between the developed and the developing world. But with Donald Trump coming in, somebody who's pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, somebody who doesn't think very much of the climate crisis, how do you think this is going to move forward then?
Well, Shreya, first and foremost, this COP20 or COP29, all these things, I have not much hope from them because the developed countries will never give climate-friendly technology or green technologies for free. They actually look at it from business perspective. So for many of the developing countries and small economies to invest on alternate viable, energy transition mechanisms is very expensive. Now, if you look at it from two perspectives, number one, individually, countries like India have done far more on issues of climate change than probably G20 as a forum. Whether you talk about our transition in terms of EV or you talk about our metro rail or many other initiatives, including the LED bulb, I think these are small steps in a larger direction. But you have to balance between priorities of taking care of aspirations of people and at the same time taking care of climate. But when you talk about G20 as a forum, let me reiterate this point. G20, if it has to be taken seriously, it has to have a secretariat. It has to be functioning 365 days of the year. It cannot be, suppose if I'm a country which is fed up with United Nations and I want to look into an alternate, where would I go to the G20 address? There is no address. So should I wait for the next year's forum and next year's summit to take place? So if it has to be an alternate to the United Nations, if it has to be taken seriously in terms of climate change issues, first and foremost, give up from the hope from the developed countries that they will invest. You have to do it on your own because your own climate is at stake. Look at Delhi situation in Delhi. And at the same time, G20 needs to find its own finance. G20 needs to have its permanent address, a secretariat, a functioning bureaucracy that will deliver. That is not there. So for me, G20 has been great in terms of diagnosing the problem that there are issues with United Nations and we need an alternate mechanism, but it hasn't been able to address the issues because it doesn't have a fund of its own. It doesn't work 365 days of a year. It is only about talk, talk, and talk again. That is where I think we have a problem. And I think if you look at this particular summit also, the bilateral summits that Prime Minister Modi did would have far bigger impact even in G20 2024 than probably the G20 forum as a whole. So many things have to change, but I would still say people have bigger hope from BRICS than they have from G20. And that is because the major powers within BRICS have the clout and the capacity to pull something on their own, but even BRICS will have to develop a secretariat and cannot be just a forum for talks every year. So these organizations need to evolve, which they haven't as of yet, to become viable alternate.
Yeah, let me take this across to Ambassador Goel. Pathikrit, Ambassador Goel, you are somebody who has experience in bureaucracy. You're somebody who's been a practitioner of Indian diplomacy. Help us understand what is stopping the G20 grouping from actually having that kind of a secretariat, or the nitty-gritties that are involved in having a sort of organization, a proper solid organization that one can look up to and one can go to in resolving their crisis.
Shreya, you have started a very controversial kind of an issue here, and I will try and see how best I can answer it. First of all, is it really necessary to have a headquarters where there is a kind of an underpinning of bureaucracy or a secretariat before you can begin to do things? With the exception of the United Nations and the European Union, I don't think that many of the plurilateral organizations began with the idea of a permanent secretariat first. Because a permanent secretariat means a kind of a budget, layout, and also the prestige attached to it in terms of where it is located. In the case of the United Nations and NATO, it was simple enough. In the case of the United Nations, who were the winners at that time? And the obvious answer really was New York. It couldn't be anywhere else, really, the United Nations. And New York got ready to provide the place, sell the land, and all those things. And incidentally, today, even the New York City is grudging the existence of United Nations in the city because they think the US city is paying far too much for their comfort. European Union and the NATO, Belgium, it had to be the only answer. Now, coming back to the developing countries blocks, and the G20, when it began, it was a kind of a dialogue between the developed economies and the market economies, emerging market, major economies. And that's the reason if you look at the spectrum of countries represented in G20, India, Argentina, Brazil, on the other hand, you have US, Canada, I don't even know why they continue to be there. They are neither an emerging economy, they are not, nor are they a developed economy. UK continues to be there because of the history. But the fact is, if we want to talk about establishing a secretariat, where would it be? You will be losing the whole years and years together in discussing the location of the secretariat. And eventually at the end of it, whichever country it is, they will start to want funding for manning the secretariat. I think it's functioning all right in this fashion. Every country which is the president becomes the coordinator for the next summit. Like in the case of India, when we became president, it was the end of 1 year. Brazil took over. Brazil began to coordinate the deliberations. And the thing is that really, I don't think the absence of a secretariat has really uh, stopped G20 from functioning what it was meant to be. It was meant to be a platform for conversations, dialogues, discussions between developed countries and developing countries. BRICS can be a good global South forum. But BRICS, when it wants to have the fund transfer on climate, where are they going to come from? They are not there in the BRICS.
Okay.
So I think it is functioning well the way it is. And I really wouldn't want to change it unless it becomes absolutely a must. Shreya.
Okay. Pathikrit, before I wrap this discussion up, I want to talk about the India-China foreign ministers meet that happened on the sidelines of the G20 Summit in Brazil. Important takeaways, the fact that Indian foreign minister has emphasized on India being against unilateral approaches towards borders and the kind of dominance that China, keeps on trying to do. Apart from, of course, the two leaders also discussing Kailash Mansarovar Yatra being resumed, data transfer in terms of Trans-River data, and all of that really happening. Clearly, India and China moving towards a broader resolution of not just the border conflicts, but the entire other, associated aspects of this relationship.
Well, you're absolutely right, Shreya, and that was one of the preconditions that India had said before, that any kind of other development can only happen if we go back to the pre-2020 April scenario. And I think China agreed to it for several reasons. But let me tell you how it is happening. First and foremost, disengagement does not mean demobilization or de-escalation. Troop deployments remain as it is, and nobody is going to, take peace for granted anymore. And at the same time, yes, there are areas of convergence between India and China. Both the countries believe that unilateral sanctions that organizations like NATO or United States impose, European Union imposes, they have tremendous impact on developing countries. That is one area. Both of them actually want reforms in multilateral institutions. Both are against the hegemony of dollar in terms of imposing sanctions or completely banning a country or suspending a country from the SWIFT mechanism for interbank telecommunication for international banking. So I think there are areas of convergence, no doubt, and that's why, in spite of all the differences, these two countries have come together in BRICS. But at the same time, yes, there are areas of divergence and status quo as well. So I think it is a step in the right direction. It doesn't mean, it was never for the last 4 years that we are almost on the verge of a conflict. Both countries knew its limitations. And at the same time, it was also important that trade to continue because there are reasons for which India would still require China for its own economic growth. And for China, looking up to the Indian market is very important, primarily because of the condition in European Union and United States, because of the tariffs being imposed. So it is a symbiotic relationship which is growing.
And I think the two countries have realized this, Pathikrit, and they are moving towards that sort of resolution. I'll have to wrap this up here, but those are live visuals coming out of Brazil. We've got the family photo once again of the G20 leaders, and thankfully you've got Biden, Trudeau and Meloni this time around in the family photograph. Thankfully, all three are there. Prime Minister Modi, of course, right there with the host country's leader, Brazil, right there at the center, along with American President Joe Biden. Those are live visuals coming out. And that family photograph being taken, the conclusion of the G20 Summit. And as this summit concludes, our conversation here on Global Mirror also concludes. Thank you very much to Ambassador Suresh Kumar Goel and Pathikrit Payne for joining us and sharing your perspective on the G20 Summit 2024. With that, viewers, it's a wrap on Global Mirror. Thank you very much for joining us at the moment. Up ahead is Sneha Koshi with Beyond the Headline.